Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. A thin mist clung low across the sand, curling around the legs of the observatory towers like something remembering an older, forgotten storm. Every building carried the silence of a place too far from roads, too far from careless voices. Inside the main array, machines hummed through assigned routines, scratching out numbers no one read anymore. Night after night, skies poured their endless warnings into idle instruments, unnoticed, unchallenged. Alvarez leaned against the cracked vinyl of a stool bolted to the floor, rubbing a thumb across the corner of a printout left abandoned near the monitors. Another quiet shift, another parade of meaningless noise. Data streams, signals, background radiation, solar winds sweeping harmlessly across systems too far gone to care. Somewhere beyond the hard glare of the terminal lights, the desert whispered against glass, brushing fine sand into the cracks. Routine demanded a sweep of the white dwarf belt catalogued decades earlier, a graveyard of stars marked and forgotten by faster, newer satellite. Fingers traced the expected signals, each one a perfect match to its archive, lifeless as bones. All but one. Coordinates aligned imperfectly. A rhythm inside the static whispered not randomness but insistence. A beat, halting, too regular for comfort. Alvarez leaned closer, adjusting the sensitivity filters, sliding gain higher until the hiss gave way to short bursts separated by unnatural silences. On the far side of the lab, Gonzalez sipped burned coffee, eyelids sagging half-closed. She waved him off without rising from her chair. Glitches happened. Weather interference. Stray broadcast. Better to reset calibration than indulge late-night superstition. Still, Alvarez could not let it go. The pulses persisted, too stubborn, too patient. Hours folded into each other while oscilloscopes mapped the strange rhythm across backlit screens. No natural phenomenon filed under previous surveys matched. No passing satellites reported interference. No earthbound source accounted for the drift frequency shift visible on recalibration. Morse code existed only in textbooks now, an antique of human history, irrelevant to radio astronomy protocols. Yet under the right filters, the pattern revealed itself without asking permission. Dots. Dashes. Spaces placed with mechanical cruelty. Supervising technicians dismissed the discovery. Equipment degradation. Data bleed. Temperature variance affecting the array's focus. Alvarez pressed, submitting recordings annotated in meticulous detail, mapping the repeating intervals, pointing to anomalous precision beyond explainable drift. 3 nights later, the Leadership Council convened without ceremony. Faces drawn in sickly monitor light, leaning forward with attention unspoken but shared. No official memos circulated. No record kept. Authority spoke in low, clipped command. Verification teams were summoned from coastal cities. Secrecy reinforced through verbal agreements signed with little protest. No press. No external networks. No conversation outside assigned teams. Everything funneled into private storage systems operating independent from national grid. The observatory's focus shifted overnight. Telescopes realigned to watch a single dying star with no planets, no dust clouds, no signature save for a voice tapping against the silence of interstellar waste. Staff moved under the weight of something unspoken, a gravitational pull heavier than the desert's own silence. Papers removed from open desk. Laughter vanished from break rooms. Bulletins replaced with blank schedules. Visitors rerouted without explanation. At night, through narrow hallways lit by emergency strips, Alvarez walked alone to the signal processing lab, carrying a sheaf of annotated logs tucked beneath one arm. Each page heavier than the last. Each line of dashes and dots stacking across his mind, threading connections he could not yet name. Somewhere behind reinforced glass, antennae strained toward a star whose light had died long before the first cathedral stone was set in Europe's soil. A dead sun, whispering words buried by centuries, speaking in a language no living thing had taught it. The signal pulsed. The desert held its breath. Glass panes along the processing wing rattled under the pulse of nighttime gusts, sand hissing across sealed doors like warnings too old to understand. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed above a conference table stained with the rings of forgotten cups and sleepless arguments. Monitors stretched across one wall, each screen crowding the next, alive with strings of cold, mathematical translations. Specialists brought from Santiago, Paris, Jerusalem hunched over battered keyboards, fingers tracing gaps between the transmissions, arguments low and bitter. Linguistic algorithms failed first. Patterns within the pulse refused to conform to modern phonetic. Morse provided the skeleton, but meaning remained trapped behind a wall older than the machines trying to break it. Hours lengthened without mercy. One fragment gave way grudgingly, pushed open by a professor who had not left her chair since morning. A cluster of words, reconstructed by hand, mapped into a liturgical form unfamiliar to most gathered there. Latin, but not the language sung in surviving cathedrals. An earlier kind. Hardened, stripped of familiar rites, closer to funeral rites spoken over forgotten graves. Breaths held tight across the room. Eyes gathered toward the projection, where translation codes snapped into place. Phrases stitched together, thin and trembling under the weight of centuries. References to seals broken, lamps extinguished, judgments written in the sky's movements. Each phrase landed with a shudder none could name aloud. Further decryption pulled deeper language from the star's broken pulse. Early ecclesiastical Greek slid into view, syntax wound in precision no human improvisation could explain. Passages that should have belonged to crumbling monasteries long buried under empire ruins surfaced clean, intact, untouched by human revision. Arguments splintered across disciplines. Some demanded error-checking protocols repeated. Others insisted external interference accounted for the anomalies. No one offered rational explanation for how a dead star, unreachable by any civilization past or present, could transcribe forbidden prayers outlawed before continents bore their current names. In the back of the room, silent figures with no university affiliation recorded every word, pens scratching without pause. Their presence offered no comfort. Their silence warned louder than any command. Fragmented translations converged onto familiar references whispered in excommunication orders dating back to inquisitorial courts, documents scholars were forbidden to quote openly even today. Manuscripts condemned not for their theology, but for their descriptions of celestial events centuries beyond human observation. Hands shook over keyboards. Pencils snapped unnoticed under white-knuckled grip. Each discovery unwound certainty without ceremony. Faith in physics, faith in history, faith in clean separation between myth and measurement crumbled grain by grain. Whispers grew among the younger researchers, theories swapped in low tones during restless shift. The project no longer studied a signal. It studied intent. No one spoke openly of what lurked within the transmissions, yet everyone shifted glances toward locked doors and muted cameras. Pages of handwritten notes accumulated on worn desks, each line darker than the last, translations no longer needing interpretation. Warnings, predictions, declarations of movements in the heavens that no telescope had yet reported but whose mathematics matched too closely for denial. Some began refusing night shifts near the main arrays, offering excuses thin enough to reveal their fear. Others sought refuge in numbers, running error margins in endless loops, praying for faults to emerge that never did. Past the perimeters of the observatory, the desert stretched without judgment, unconcerned by the collapse of certainty inside its heart. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent witnesses to a discovery too heavy for the thin walls to contain. Inside the decoding lab, words no human had spoken in living memory lined the walls, cold and unblinking. The signal remained, unchanged, patient, waiting. Dust gathered on the edges of the archive boxes flown in under night orders, their contents still sealed beneath chains of bureaucratic stamps older than many of the men who ordered their release. Fluorescent bulbs overhead buzzed low, casting long reflections across cracked linoleum as chairs scraped back to make room for ancient knowledge no one had wanted to disturb. Historians, brought in from deep within cloistered departments, spread parchment copies and scanned microfilms across battered tables, handling each sheet with a reverence no orders could hasten. Latin phrases traced along curling margins. Greek annotations stitched hastily between paragraphs. Footnotes scrawled in desperate hands, some so faded it took angled light to catch the marks. Pages cross-referenced with sealed tribunal records revealed a pattern first dismissed as hysteria centuries ago. A manuscript condemned not for heresy alone, but for the claim it made, that heavenly bodies carried within their movements warnings scripted before humanity raised its first walls. A book described in whispering accusations recorded by inquisitors who understood neither its language nor its calculations. Codex Omega, a name spoken only in burnt confessionals and confiscated letters. A manuscript said to chart the decay of kingdoms through conjunctions of stars unknown to medieval astronomers. Predictions of eclipses by invisible bodies. Accounts of skyfires burning lands unseen by any scribe. Testimonies of seas devouring coasts still uncharted at the time of the writing. Thin fingers, wrinkled by years among forgotten shelves, slid across translation matrices, fitting signal fragments against forbidden verses. Alignment emerged not through forced interpretation but brutal arithmetic. Coordinates mapped to star charts predating telescopic verification by 5 centuries. Solar oscillations outlined in detail unknown to Renaissance Europe, perfectly matching modern spectrographic analysis. Panic moved slowly through the gathered scholars, first hidden behind long pauses and unnecessary rechecking, later bleeding into tightened voices and meetings held behind locked doors. Debates rose over coffee grown cold, arguments thick with unspoken terror. If authenticity held, centuries of scientific independence fractured into questions no model could explain. Partial reconstructions of the manuscript began to take shape. Isolated sections stitched together with care usually reserved for sacred relic. Fragmented predictions rendered into full prophecies when matched against modern astronomical data. A comet trajectory erased from official records after near-miss analysis resurfaced almost word for word in a scroll translated from the star's broadcast. Cross-referencing historical events with the few complete passages revealed unnerving precision. Kingdoms drowned in blood following documented meteor storms. Famines shadowing years of anomalous solar minima. Earthquakes rupturing cities after planetary alignments described with geometric coldness centuries before plate tectonics entered scientific thought. Arguments lost their vigor. What remained grew heavier than language allowed. Observers no longer questioned whether the signals matched human history. Attention shifted toward the realization that what humanity called catastrophe, the transmissions recorded as milestones. By midnight, none dared suggest coincidence. Hands reached across continents, dredging closed Vatican archives, sealed Ottoman records, lost Alexandrian indexes. Cross-disciplinary teams stitched together timelines too cold, too exacting to dismiss. Within the observatory walls, air changed. Laughter once shared between tired technicians vanished. The clink of coffee cups against stone countertops faded. Conversations dropped their last defenses, settling into quiet stares over printed lines describing future nights when stars would tear open the sky. Each page reconstructed from the lost manuscript sharpened the horror. Not allegory, not dream. A system of accounting built not in parable but precision, measured in years, planetary movements, solar flares yet to come. On the edge of the desert, where cold winds rattled the locked gates, the white dwarf pulsed on, patient beyond human understanding, whispering futures buried once and found again at a time too late to turn away. Charts sprawled across the concrete walls, pinned in careful sequence, the glow of terminal screens staining them with cold blue reflections. Every fresh decoding session yielded timestamps embedded in the transmissions, small anomalies at first, but persistent enough that denial no longer served as shield. Star collapses registered within the past 3 centuries matched precisely against dates hidden in the reconstructed manuscript. Solar anomalies logged in silent observatories decades before human understanding caught up. Mergers of black holes, light swallowed across unimaginable distances, listed in the signals long before space-based instruments had scratched their patterns into human databases. Each finding compressed the room tighter around its occupants, until breathing itself seemed like an interruption. Clocks ticked louder against the sterile walls, carrying minutes into hours without permission. Data overlays confirmed it without rhetoric or sympathy. The transmissions mirrored not only past astronomical events but did so in their correct chronological order, marching through recorded history like an accountant's ledger filled with births and deaths only the heavens had noticed. Initial protests crumbled under the sheer volume of alignment. One rogue event could be coincidence. Dozens, layered with precision to match exact timescales, demanded something colder, something mechanical beyond random intersections of myth and star charts. The dead star spoke in sequences, indifferent to human astonishment, indifferent to disbelief, marking history in pulses counted against light years and gravitational distortions no medieval scribe could have imagined yet somehow recorded. Hands moved slower across keyboards. Breath caught before speaking. Arguments shifted from probability margins toward something heavier. Purpose. A dead sun reciting a liturgy of catastrophe stitched across generations. A star's fading heartbeat recounting plagues, wars, cosmic collisions with no embellishment, no sorrow. Only sequence. Worse still, subtle irregularities appeared toward the most recent transmissions. Gaps widened between expected events. Intervals shortened. Decoding scripts revealed newly formed structures layered atop older ones, patterns not merely recounting but leaning toward events yet unseen by any telescope or satellite. Silence settled in rooms once filled with the mechanical clicks of decoding equipment. Scientists who once spoke with clipped certainty about methodologies now hovered between screens, waiting for confirmations no model could guarantee. Eyes drifted toward sky charts at odd hours, scanning for anomalies the coded signals whispered were already preparing to tear through human ignorance. Moral fracture lines spidered through the project without warning, arguments flaring between the necessity of complete disclosure and the danger of global collapse into superstition or madness. Voices raised under the hum of the processing towers carried panic too raw to hide. Some pressed for publication. Others argued for total secrecy, convinced that unleashing knowledge of future disasters would accelerate their arrival. Loyalty frayed. Trust collapsed under its own weight. Observers monitored every conversation, notebooks growing heavier with names and timestamp. Some team members submitted resignation letters no one processed. Others found solace in redoubling analysis, as if quantifying the end could offer protection against it. Across the desert, skies stretched black and motionless, hiding within their silence a world preparing for collisions only one ancient star still dared to speak aloud. Each pulse translated under flickering lights widened the gap between what humanity thought it ruled and what had already been written beyond reach. In private corners of the facility, old prayers returned, whispered by those who had forgotten them, reshaped by hands that once believed only in mathematics. No leader stood to offer direction. No consensus formed. Only quiet acceptance grew that whatever message endured within that dead star's heartbeat was not finished. Something waited beyond the last page, pressing closer with every pulse counted in sleepless hours. The translations stacked across stone-colored tables, each passage heavier than the last, their weight no longer measured in words but in consequence. Full sections of the signal, once thought poetic or metaphorical, now laid bare in precision no metaphor could hide. Solar dimming traced through recorded irradiance measurements of the past 20 years matched lines once confined to monastery shelves. Descriptions of planetary upheavals, seas boiling along unseen ridges, lands cracking along forgotten seams, found confirmation not in prophecy but in seismic charts and atmospheric data from agencies sworn to secular rigor. Screens flashed side-by-side comparisons between ancient texts and modern satellite imagery. Dust storms consuming cities, ozone thinning not as gradual depletion but as marked scars across the atmosphere, each matching phrases dismissed for centuries as religious imagination. No poetry remained in the words cast across their screens. Only record. Arguments sharpened into desperation as team members circled the same impossible decision, worn thinner with each revelation. Humanity's right to know stood against humanity's ability to survive that knowing. Meetings collapsed into accusations, pleas, broken silences filled only by the mechanical churn of servers capturing every signal pulse still whispering across the light years. Outside official containment, files slipped through firewalls thought secure. Anonymized data sets surfaced in places forbidden to name. Whispers rose on closed forums. Rumors stained quiet corners of universities. Something had been found, something beyond denial, something matching not ancient allegory but imminent catastrophe. Internal security tightened without announcement. Keycard logs compiled at new intervals. Conversations once held over coffee shifted behind closed doors, voices dropping to urgent whispers. Surveillance grew bolder, cameras sweeping corners they had once ignored, guards appearing along corridors previously left unpatrolled. Unmarked vehicles loitered just beyond perimeter fences under the pretense of equipment deliveries that never reached loading dock. Within the observatory's reinforced walls, awareness grew heavier than any command chain could mask. Badge inspections doubled without explanation. Personal devices disappeared during off-shift hours, returned without apology. Attempts to leave the grounds met bureaucratic entanglements too consistent to be coincidence. The signal continued without falter, pulsing its indictment across empty gulfs of space. Each translated fragment tightened the inevitable grip around those still trying to separate faith from fear, science from submission. Long before dawn broke across the desert ridges, news agencies caught the scent. Not through formal leaks, but through fragments, patterns, coincidences too sharp to ignore. Stories of unexplained solar behavior blended with rumors of ancient texts predicting atmospheric collapses. Editorials hesitated between disbelief and panic, cautious not to name the source they could not fully verify yet too compelled to ignore. Inside locked offices, the remaining analysts watched the world tilt closer toward knowledge it was never meant to hold without trembling. Pages no longer belonged to history. They belonged to the thin sliver of future still slipping through their fingers, counted in pulses, counted in breath. Every word from the dead star bore witness against them, a record of signs once written in sacred scrolls, now carved into the dying air itself. The desert waited beyond their glass, indifferent, patient, older than memory, older even than the star whose voice humanity had finally, fatally, learned how to hear. Morning headlines burned across glowing screens with words sharper than official statements dared to carry. Fragmented reports escaped containment protocols, flooding forums, encrypted channels, late-night radio whispers, until no state, no institution, no solitary figure of authority could silence the surge. Confirmation arrived not in announcements but in absence. Broadcasts interrupted mid-sentence, news anchors vanishing from familiar desks, websites returning blank screens where yesterday's certainty had lived. Panic needed no language. Financial markets, tethered to the illusion of predictability, convulsed before understanding could catch up. Cargo fleets rerouted without orders, banks locked vaults against invisible futures, families watched power grids flicker under strain as systems designed for slow change buckled beneath days counted not in years, but in hours. From temple pulpits to crumbling street corners, voices rose not in question but command. Repentance urged like a breath before drowning. Processions wound through broken cities under banners not seen in living memory, icons raised high against dimming suns and shifting tides. Ancient hymns twisted through modern streets where engines once ruled, old prayers shouting through handheld speakers, pleading against the silence blooming in every sky. Declarations of revival poured from mouths worn hoarse from pleading, insisting the end had not come to destroy but to renew, to call humanity back from edges it no longer saw itself approaching. Stones etched with forgotten prayers pressed into cracked asphalt. Hands lifted skyward not in triumph, but trembling, half in fear, half in hope. Government councils fractured along unseen lines, each trying to wrest control of a narrative already slipping into shadow. Martial law declared without full consent spread across territories like fire across dry leaf. Curfews fell without warning. Border gates slammed shut, not against enemies of flesh but against ideas no wall could halt. Scientific papers vanished from public record. University databases returned errors in place of theses carefully preserved for decades. Censorship wore no mask this time, no gentle phrasing, only the blunt weight of expedience disguised as protection. Armed convoys moved through abandoned neighborhoods, soldiers peering from armor-plated windows at citizens clutching crumpled leaflets quoting revelations once dismissed as superstition. Military doctrines, trained to view the unknown through crosshairs and threat assessments, refused to see prophecy where formations spoke only of tactical advantage or peril. Strategic commands mapped the stars' transmissions as coded battle language, convinced somewhere within the rhythmic warnings lay orders for forces still unseen, forces preparing to strike across dimensions they had no instruments to measure. Conferences held in concrete bunkers parsed the signals for invasion point. Emergency satellites launched without public announcement scanned celestial corridors for ships that might never come, weapons primed against phantoms stitched together by fear and calculation. Orders shifted toward building defenses against a war no one could describe except in the vocabulary of extinction. Within chambers once filled with the pretense of diplomacy, rulers argued over contingency plans drafted on napkins stained with sweat, arguments rising not over whether the danger existed, but how best to claim survival before it arrived. Above empty roads and silent towers, skies continued to blacken in slow increments no forecast could soften. Winds carried ash scents where none should have lived. Oceans moved against shores in rhythms no tide chart predicted. Crops withered under suns still shining yet somehow wrong, their heat thinner, their light splintered. The desert where the signal first spoke remained unchanged, holding its secrets beneath cold stars, while humanity beyond its borders stumbled between revelation and ruin, building altars and arsenals in equal measure, blind to which might serve them when the final light faded. The transmissions sharpened across the observatory's battered screens, final sequences pressing into the hours without mercy. No metaphors softened the data now. Each line delivered in brutal clarity. A timeline etched with decay. First, the skies shifted. Reports of sun dimming across latitudes dismissed by officials arrived too late to matter. Crops withered where soil had not changed. Harvests failed without disease, without drought, only light growing thin, not in hue but in strength. Fields stood in silence, stalks half-grown, reaching for suns that no longer fed them. Next came the waters. Tides abandoned their calendars, sweeping over coastal cities as if pulled by unseen hands, not storms, not winds, but an imbalance at the planet's own heart. Salt water invaded rivers long thought untouchable, poisoning ground from within. Maps drawn in classrooms dissolved under feet scrambling for higher ground that did not exist in sufficient measure. Birds vanished first. Migrations failed as magnetic fields shifted without warning. Navigation instruments stuttered in hands that once trusted them. Aurora lights spilled across latitudes never touched before, beauty masking the fractures blooming in the geomagnetic shield meant to hold cosmic radiation at bay. Hospitals filled with patients no virus explained, skin burned not by fire but by exposure to things unseen. Every event logged against the transmissions matched with unerring cruelty. No deviation. No mercy. Rooms once filled with theories now filled with ultimatums. Governments, staring at terminal graphs, whispered of weaponizing the knowledge. Tactical retreat. Preemptive strikes against imagined enemies before collapse reached final threshold. Generals spoke of information as artillery, strategies spun not from defense but survival of fragment. Others demanded containment. Hide the truth, bury the knowledge beneath manufactured crises, distract with wars, with spectacles, anything to delay the final recognition that no human institution remained above what loomed just beyond calculation. Factions multiplied beyond containment. Revivalists called for surrender not to any government but to what they believed had orchestrated every orbit, every molecule. They knelt in fields, in deserts, in flooded streets, praying without ceasing for a return not to safety but to alignment with forces beyond comprehension. Survivalists abandoned cities entirely, carving out isolated strongholds deep in mountain hollows, in forgotten forests, hoarding water, seeds, ammunition, convinced only brutality would see another generation's sunrise. Fatalists gathered where power still clung to habit, watching as leaders debated plans no longer relevant, drinking into cold mornings, laughing at forecasts that no longer pretended optimism. They bet cigarettes and canned rations on which country would fall first, on whether the sun itself would simply fail to rise. Each camp certain in belief, none in control. Communications fractured under geomagnetic surges. Satellites blinded. Networks shuddered into static. Countries split not by politics but by interpretation of signals still pulsing through crippled receivers, repeating in rhythms once holy, now fatal. No broadcast voice brought comfort. No anthem inspired action. Only the transmissions remained. Cold. Ordered. Inevitable. In sealed bunkers and open fields alike, humanity measured its final days not by hope but by proximity to thresholds crossed long before it understood the rules. Across continents, skies once familiar shifted into shades no painter had ever captured, colors bent by forces no instrument could fully name. Still, the stars' message continued, patient across gulfs too wide for regret. Every heartbeat of that dying light counting down across flesh, across stone, across memory itself, toward an end neither science nor faith could now deny. The transmissions slowed across trembling receivers, gaps widening between each signal, pulses drawn out like the last beats of a heart too tired to sustain its rhythm. Screens once frantic with updates dimmed to a cold cadence, marking a change no algorithm could predict. Analysis confirmed it within hours. No new astronomical events mirrored the pulses. No new celestial alignments paralleled the code. Only one final sequence remained, stabilizing into a message immune to further translation errors. The manuscript's final chapter, once fragmented across faded parchments and corrupted scrolls, now stood fully reconstructed against the lab's crumbling walls. It spoke without ambiguity of a singular event. The breaking of the last seal. A moment neither symbolic nor abstract, but named with terrifying clarity. The threshold after which collapse could not be undone, a point where humanity's survival depended not on technology, not on politics, not on wealth, but on realignment to an original moral order written into the cosmos itself. No voice rose to question the implication anymore. Each researcher, soldier, advisor who remained felt the message not as command but as indictment, a weighing of every decision made without regard for the structure upon which existence balanced. Science bent low under the weight of its own certainty. Faith, once mocked in whispered jokes between late-night shifts, returned not in sermons but in silence, in hands that shook without cause, in dreams soaked through with visions of skies collapsing into blackness. Identity fractured without warning. The careful masks of professionalism fell, revealing faces hollowed by guilt, by anger, by helplessness too old to name. Some wept alone in corridors stripped of pretense. Others stared long hours into dead monitors, searching for errors that could no longer be manufactured. Attempts at unity collapsed faster than the communications that tried to sustain them. Emergency conferences called from glass towers failed before first agendas completed. Mistrust flowered between nations too long accustomed to bargaining truth for advantage. No summit survived its own opening statement. Accusations replaced treaties. Secrets poisoned every offer of collaboration. Delegates disappeared between flights without explanation. Borders flared into violence before official declarations caught up. Religious leaders, once galvanized by revelation, fractured along old, bloody lines. Doctrines split hairs into weapons. Sects turned on each other, each claiming rightful interpretation of the final message, each branding the others as impostors dragging humanity into ruin. Survivalist enclaves sealed gates against cries for sanctuary. Revivalist camps fractured as leaders disappeared under suspicion of compromise. Fatalist enclaves emptied into the streets, not in protest, but in eerie processions carrying nothing but the certainty that no plan remained worth making. The pulse from the white dwarf continued, unwavering, indifferent to the noise of a world folding in upon itself. A steady rhythm, like breath before the first cry of a newborn or the final sigh of the dying, measuring humanity not in greatness or cruelty but in alignment, in how far the created had strayed from the architect. Every institution trembled under knowledge that could not be unsaid. Every monument built to human certainty crumbled against a message older than their foundations, a judgment passed not by angry gods or indifferent physics but by a universe wounded beyond simple repair. Outside the shattered cities, under skies smeared with unnatural colors, the dying light carried no promise of salvation. Only a final chance, slipping like ash between fingers too slow to grasp it. Each heartbeat of the dying star tolling the measure of time left to a species staring across a chasm it could no longer bridge with force, nor science, nor prayer uttered too late. The first fractures tore across the continental shelves without warning, seas devouring cities that had stood through wars, through plagues, through every arrogance of steel and glass. Where temples once stretched their hands to clouded heavens, waters now pooled among broken spires. Ash drifted across mountain passes where no fire had burned. Winds hollowed great forests into skeletal remains before satellites could register the loss. Famine followed, swift and absolute. Crops withered before harvest, not by drought nor pestilence, but by a subtle poisoning of soil and air, a decay no scientist could halt nor priest could bless away. Markets collapsed into silence. Highways fell silent under the dust of abandoned transport convoys. Families counted days against the last preserved grains, weighed survival against compassion with hands that shook under the weight of decision. In the ruins of great cities, pockets of survivors gathered beneath broken stone, murmuring prayers once forgotten. Scriptures once recited only in ritual now bled into every breath, not as liturgy, but as lifelines thrown across a collapsing void. Songs rose in shattered sanctuaries without choirs, voices threading into darkness without expectation of answer, only the knowledge that silence waited worse than despair. Beyond these small islands of humility, chaos fed on itself. Armies splintered into warring clans. Weapons crafted to defend borders turned inward upon their makers. Towns disappeared in flashes of light swallowed by dust and silence before even the dying sun could mark their passing. Law fell to superstition, superstition to violence, violence to resignation. The stars' signal endured. Night after night, the observatories that had first caught the signal fell into disrepair. Roofs torn away by storms unpredicted. Instruments corroded under acidic rains. Yet somewhere, beyond broken power grids and crumbling antennae, the signal pressed on, unchanged, unmoved, as if bound not to the survival of its listeners but to a duty written deeper than human memory. Those who rebuilt did so with hands scarred from loss, carving shelters into hillsides, raising altars from the debris of abandoned cities, planting seeds into dirt they prayed still remembered how to cradle life. New laws emerged not from councils, but from the shattered bones of revelation. No king declared them. No soldier enforced them. They rose from necessity, from a whispered knowledge that the old ways had been weighed and found wanting. In the colder reaches of forgotten lands, where few remained to remember what had been lost, the signal continued its slow litany across empty sky. At last, even the instruments surrendered. Screens once etched with pulses faded into dead glass. Algorithms that had tracked every variation faltered, codes slipping beyond human syntax into something unmeasurable, untouched by numbers or translation keys. No engineer could explain it. No theologian could claim ownership. Some believed the signal had changed, moving beyond the capacity of human comprehension as a river moves beyond the reach of a child's hands. Others whispered it was not the signal that changed, but the listeners who had been stripped of the means to hear, like towers once proud, now crumbled into forgotten stones. The star remained, pulsing into eternity, carrying a message no longer measured in seconds or words, but in silence heavier than all the histories written before it. Under skies thick with morning light, in fields sown with more hope than certainty, the last remnants of a wounded species looked upward through fractured clouds, sensing without words that something had passed beyond reach, yet not beyond presence. A voice not silenced. A judgment not revoked. A signal, unwavering, waiting for something humanity had only begun to remember how to seek. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.